We now move to our second speaker, Dr. Virginia Arechavala Gomesa. She's a professor in Basque Foundation of Science and leads a newly created neuromuscular disorders research group at the Biocruces Vizcaya Health Research Institute in Spain. She will present why don't researchers publish negative results in genetics. Please, Dr. Virginia, the floor is yours.
Hi. First of all, I want to say thank you for the invitation. When you did invite me to an educational session, what you didn't know is that I came here to educate myself, first of all, because there's plenty of things that I still don't know about how to manage negative results. But I would like to share with you what I've been learning in the last few years. So those are my conflicts of interest, which I am including there just to show that I'm coming from a perspective of an academic group, small academic group, working in rare disorders. And I also chair a network of researchers on the subject of delivery of antisense RNA therapies. And that, is a slightly different hat that I wear from time to time. So there's lots of the things that I'm going to be discussing that had already been discussed before in the previous presentations, but I just want to give a little bit of food for thought for the roundtable that we're going to have pretty much right after this. So just about what are negative results, if I were not really publishing those, and what do researchers think about sharing this kind of results, and if there is something that we could do better. So to begin with, I just would like to share with you what I think about research. When I picture research, I think of us as a community being dropped in the middle of a huge maze in which there's no light, and we need to find a way out. And the way we do this is to just become little groups, send groups over, and find a way out. Then we reconvene and we share what we've learned about the way. And there will be people telling us, that is a dead end. And I've mapped this, so you don't need to go there again. And I've left some torches there, so then we know which is the path. And there will be a point eventually when someone will find the exit to that maze. And probably those people will take most of the praise and the glory of finding, finally getting everybody out of there. But actually, without everybody else being able to document the way out and knowing, which is the structure of the maze, there will be no exit. And I think as researchers, we seem to think of the way we do things, and we need to know that our work needs to be just small steps towards a bigger goal. And that's the way I see it. And the way we do research is by having an hypothesis. And you have an hypothesis and you set up some experiments to prove or disprove that hypothesis. So there will be, in this particular one will be light color has effect on the growth of the plant. You set an experiment and you said, yes, this is actually happening or not. But this particular thing doesn't always happen. And as it has been mentioned before in a paper published around 10 years ago, there were some indications that those results in which negative results were published had been less reported than good results, or results that did concord with the initial hypothesis. So this is a problem. And actually, I said, okay, that was 10 years ago, maybe things have changed since. So I had a little experiment of my own last week, and I just went to bioRxiv and I checked the results. And actually, the good thing about that particular server is that it's divided on new results, confirmatory results, and contradictory results. And if you check contradictory results, they are increasing. This is great. And if you check confirmatory results, which are that boring things in which you do again something that has been reported before, they're also increasing. But actually, when you check the new results, they are increasing way over the amount of research. So actually, the percentage of negative or contradictory results or confirmatory results is pretty much set to 2.5% or in total 5% of all the results, which means that new results are 95% of the preprints that we see there. And that is not even going through to what gets published. So it's really not a lot of it. So there's been a lot of talk about a problem to reproduce results, and that's a paper that was also published a few years back. And in that paper, quite a lot of researchers were asked if they had found trouble to reproduce something that had already been published. And the majority said yes, even when they tried to reproduce their own research, which is quite frightening. And selective reporting and pressure to publish were mentioned as some of the main reasons why they couldn't reproduce again what they've done before. So there is obviously something about research and integrity, but there is also, the way we see those results. So as I told you before, I represent a network of researchers, mostly in the fields of RNA therapeutics. In this network, we are a combination between basic researchers on particular disorders, nucleic acid chemistry experts, delivery experts, and we also come from either academia or pharma, clinicians, and we also have some people representing patients. So we had our own small survey to see what do people thought about sharing research and also specifically about sharing negative results. So this is the objectives of our action, and as you can see, sharing and published results is already written in the core of our network, because we've been worried about this from the very beginning, mostly because we work on rare disorders, and there we cannot afford to miss any results. So in our survey that was published recently, we first talk about open access. Open access is something that we all should be doing, and actually it's been 10 years since it's been almost mandatory to a point. And as you probably all know, there are many routes to open access, and many of them include paying money, although there are some options in which you don't need to pay, which is the green route that you may see here. With that option, you have the opportunity to publish perhaps your own version of the paper, publish in the repository of your university or others that are available to researchers, and then you can publish it either immediately or with a bit of delay. But when we ask our researchers why they were not published in open access, they said, those are too expensive, and there was no option in the paper I was choosing. And actually, when they said, okay, you couldn't do it open access, but did you perhaps leave it into a repository or your own website? And the majority didn't publish it anywhere. They just published it and went on to the next experiment, which is a bit of a pity. But the main thing is that we are all driven by impact factors, which is a pain and is a pity. And most people, when they do choose a paper, say, okay, what is the highest impact factor journal I can go to? And how popular is that within my field of research? And those are usually a combination of those two are the ones that will help you choose which paper you're going to be using. An impact factor is something that is actually not made up, but is a company that sells it to researchers. So really, impact factor is something that I don't know if we should care about that much, but we do care. Actually, when we talk about the negative results, not just any results, open access, but when you go to negative results, many people in our network, the vast majority thought that they were really, really interesting. But when we asked them if they had published them, they didn't. And most of them, well, they gave us tons of answers of why they were not doing it, but the majority said, it took too long to publish something that it was negative, and it was difficult. And actually, there's a very recent publication in which they did a slightly larger cohort than us. It's just that most of this cohort were French researchers, and they also had the same outcome. Basically, if you have a look here, the reasons for not publishing negative results were that it was not enough time and it was difficult. So it takes too long, it's too difficult, and why does it take too long? Shouldn't we researchers be there to do this? Shouldn't we be paid to do this? But actually, the main problem is the assessment of researchers. We are assessed by how much we publish and where do we publish it, and we need to publish it in, the first decile or quartile, and the best impact factor, and our jobs and our next grant and our new project depend on that. And until that changes, I could be here all day and next week and the following year, and that's not going to change. So this is something that we do need to convey to funders and to institutes, because if they keep on examining us on the impact factor, and they keep on using useless variables like they just put, my institute just made a list of, they sum up all the impact factors of a research group, which is something that makes absolutely no sense, but it's done. So we need to change that. So, and we need to change that because of DORA, which is not this one, but this one. We are supposed to have a declaration on research assessment that is going to help us, and quite a lot of research institutions say, yes, I do adhere to this, but then they don't do it. So we need to ask them to please, do as they say, because many of them say that they're going to adhere to this, and then they don't. And there's also the Leiden Manifesto, which also gives some guidelines of how we should be assessed, but it's still not happening. So that's on the bad things. So I'm going to give you a few examples of I've experienced it in my career and things that I think we could be doing, and I will be very happy to hear of more ways to do this because I'm still learning. I've had a few experiences, such as the previous speaker. So this is a paper we published a few years back. We were very happy with this. It was published in Lancet Neurology. We are a group of researchers working in rare diseases, and we were developing an orphan drug, and that drug was for a rare disease. It was also an exon-skipping RNA therapy, an oligonucleotide, and there were only 5 other drugs approved in the world of that type at the time. So we went through tons of different hurdles, not just for the chemistry, also for the outcome measures, tons of little things that we thought could be useful for other researchers, either on rare disorders or on this particular kind of drug. And that we thought, we need to share this because we've been through all those and we've made so many mistakes. We didn't want someone to do the same thing. And we also were very happy because those are some of the authors of the paper. And those are patients and regulators. We had people from the European Medicine Agency. We have clinicians. We had researchers. So we were very happy with this. So then we published it, and it was not open access. So quite a lot of people that we wanted to reach with this paper couldn't read it, because particularly we also wanted patients and the associations to be able to read this freely. So what we did was to do our own preprint. And this is a preprint copy. We made it pretty. We put here the, what is the preprint, and we link here to the publication, and we put it everywhere. We put it in our repositories. We put it on our websites. We put it also on ResearchGate, which is a social media platform. It's not a repository, but did the trick. So it was very widely shared, and it was very widely commented, downloaded. So we saw that people were using it, and actually it's been quite nicely cited, and it had quite a lot of traction in Altmetrics. That is on my own website, where I usually keep links to the papers and the open access versions of it. So those are things you can do. But not everybody has time to do their own website, etc. So there are domain-specific repositories that you can search for data and also for publications. So you can have something like Re3 data, or you have Zenodo, in which you can publish things and get a digital object identifier, so then people can cite you. They don't always do, but it's the start. And then, there is the preprints for your publications. Some journals are now more keen to accept those, and this is great. And probably during the pandemic, you've seen a huge increase in preprints, and that is good and bad. And that is a very interesting paper, the one I'm mentioning here, in which it shows a little bit of the good and the bad things about having all these things being shown to the public before peer review. There were lots of bad things, but also really good things as well. And it kind of shows how, science is done on just kind of live before the eyes of the community. There are things that had also been mentioned before, preprint review. This is good. I did try it. I was an early adopter and the jury's still out. We did publish something and it was reviewed, the preprint was reviewed before being sent to journals. I don't think it made it any quicker in our case, but as I said, we did it at the very beginning of this kind of action. I also had a Windows phone, what can I say? I try to do things early and sometimes they don't work as well as I wish, but I think it could get better eventually. There are also things about, those not sexy, those experiments are not sexy enough, replication studies. So this, for example, is an award that is given to people to replicate work, which is good, but it's still, a drop in the ocean. So for negative results, in our case, we've done a few things. As I said, I work in this network of researchers, and a couple of our members have cost-edited a whole issue of the journal in the Nucleic Acid Therapeutics, which is the journal of the Oligonucleotide Therapy Society. And we had a whole issue dedicated to this. 9 papers were received, only 6 were accepted. They went through all the rounds of being reviewed, and we had quite a large, some of them had been cited a lot, some of them have not been cited, I guess pretty much like any other journal. That's what happens if you publish something. So they shouldn't be different if the science is well done from any other research. I also work in neuromuscular disorders, so we also did an issue on negative results in this particular journal, the Journal of Neuromuscular Diseases. And there are a few good and not, well, all of them were good examples, but they're slightly different in their outcome. So this is something I did like very much because it was the result of a clinical trial. And we got people from the company that were very, very good at sharing the data rather quickly, because sometimes you feel that companies may not be that keen to publish not so good results. Now they're starting to be pushed in that direction as well, but they published the results of the clinical trial that hadn't gone as well as they wish. And we also had this other thing. This was a paper that had been published in PNAS a few years back, in which they showed that there was a drug that in a model for a neuromuscular disorder seemed to do something quite interesting. So they were looking into going into a clinical trial, and they went to a patient association for funding. What those patients did was to ask someone else to replicate the data, so in this particular experiment, they had given something to the mice, and those were the untreated mice and treated mice, and they saw some results. What they did in the replication study elsewhere was to include a wild-type control, and that response that looked interesting didn't look as interesting as before. And they also had yet a third laboratory to do some replication studies, and in that lab, they couldn't find the plasma levels high enough to be of any effect. There may be still very good things to come out from the very first work, but I think rushing into a clinical trial probably would have been a bit premature, and actually this was not funded. So the first paper was published in PNS, so huge impact factor. The rebuttal, the research report showing that that didn't quite happen was published in the Journal of Neuromuscular Disorders. Original authors were not happy, so they sent a letter to complain, and the authors of the replication studies sent another letter. I don't think they like each other very much these days. But the thing is, well, the first paper was published in a high impact factor paper. The other two were published in a journal that has no impact factor. I really like this journal. It has lots of very good, very thorough people in the editorial board. It has very nice peer review. And if I could choose, I would probably send most of my publications there, because the readership is bang the people that I want to target, but has no impact factor. So when I'm choosing a journal and I'm thinking of the student that it needs to apply for a grant, I sometimes cannot afford to send something here. which is a pity. And if it wasn't because we are being assessed on impact factors, you will probably see many more things published elsewhere. But that's life. So how do we get most of what we do? So this is something by Thomas Edison talking on negative results. And I really liked when I found this quote that he was, looking for negative results, and they were as valuable to him as positive results. And he famously tried around 1,000 times to do something that ended up being the light bulb. So there is a lot to learn from negative results. So if I can say something from here, although I'm still learning, as I said, will be for researchers to please share as much as you can. Please share, even ugly results. To funders, please acknowledge work well done, not sexy or fancy or hype. And for patients, which in my case, because I come from rare disorders, are a huge drive force, demand replication studies, open access publications, and also fund boring research. Because boring is sexy, I have to say. So please do so. So this is the cost action, the network that I lead, if you want to have a look. That is my research group. And also those are my contact details if any of you have more ideas or more suggestions of how we can do better. So thank you very much.
Excellent presentation, Professor Virginia. Thank you so much. After these two brilliant talks on the impact and importance of negative results by Dr. Devang and Professor Virginia, I think we are absolutely ready to get our hands dirty with our panel discussion session, where it is your chance to ask some tough questions from our speakers and to editor-in-chiefs. To the on-site participants, please ask questions by using the microphone in the room. There are two of them. Please introduce yourself and speak slowly into the microphone. For those who are attending online, you can use the session chat. Please drop your questions in the question and answer box. Juliana and I will direct the questions to the speakers.
We are pleased to invite these two further remarkable names to join us, Dr. Magdalene Skipper, an editor-in-chief in Nature, and Dr. Özder McNeil, editor-in-chief in European Journal of Human Genetics. We'd like to thank you, Professor Hevan van der Schuren, mentor to Dr. Devang during his PhD. He will be joining us remotely on behalf of Dr. Devang from Leuven.
If you have questions, you can ask by the microphone.
Hi, I'm Celia Soares. I'm from Portugal, and I have a question. It's obvious that we need negative results, but how do you fit that necessity in our model of training with students and postdocs needing high-impact papers to progress in their career?
Yeah, it's on. Hi, I don't know, basically. I think there are a few things that we can do, and I wish it wasn't necessary to get them impact factor publications and so on. But I think there are a few things that we can do, and sometimes there are little things that we can publish that we never do because they're not big enough to make it into a paper, etc. So I think lately I've been thinking more often of this very small experiment in which you use that antibody that didn't work, etc. I think those are also little things that you can publish in small repositories. You get a digital object identifier, and you can start building things for those students. Obviously, that would never give them a grant, but I think if we start little by little, we probably can change the way, but I think it has to come from above, the way we're being assessed. But there are also things that we can do. I'm thinking more and more lately about machine learning and all this theory of trash in and trash out. There's going to be a point when artificial intelligence are going to check all that data and give us answers. And if we only give them positive results, it's going to be impossible for them to be able to figure out what we are really looking at. And I think we need to make the case for well-done science in general, well-trained researchers setting up good controls for the experiments, proper experimental, numbers, ends, so then our students learn how to do science properly. I wish we could protect them from the impact factor mill, but so far I haven't learned how to do that. So I think there is a combination of both.
If I can follow up on this, it was touched on a few times during the presentations, including, I think, most emphatically in your presentation, Virginia. I completely agree that it really is high time that the system of evaluation of researchers changed. It's something that we in Nature continue to write about. We have certainly written about it under my leadership in the last 4 years, but before that also. We're obviously not the only ones who talk about it, and yet the status quo by and large persists. I was actually slightly horrified by the addition of impact factors that you mentioned in your institute. That's a new one, I'd not heard of it. The good side of this is that you will all be aware of the fact that a number of institutes, some university departments and some funders begin to consider a much wider type of contribution that all of you make to the research ecosystem. You don't spend most of your time writing papers, you spend many other things. You mentioned publishing maybe smaller papers or smaller outputs. In this community, perhaps more than many others, why don't we consider data sharing as an important contribution to the research community? These days in particular, data sets, data repository records have DOIs. We can consider them for citations in a similar way that we look at papers. There are many other contributions that each one of you makes to the research ecosystem. And I really think it's about time that it would that the system changed. You are the future of the system, of course, and I would really recommend that you push for that change and you bring about yourselves when you begin to assume these positions of responsibility and influence. As an editor-in-chief of a journal, I of course would say that publishing papers is important, but it's not the only thing that's important. And publishing papers that report negative results, replications, case studies, each of these examples was mentioned here, as well as retractions and corrections to papers, is very important to us. And I can give you plenty of examples of each of these categories that have appeared in Nature as well. But I do think that in the end, we're coming back to the evaluation question.
Clinically negative papers are very important. In genetics, you invalidate an association between a disease-causing gene and disease, so you can conclusively say that this disease is not caused by a given genetic variation. That's a very important negative finding to go into literature. It's actually very impactful clinically, even if it's not in the highest impact journal. And in the UK, we do consider the clinical impact of research findings as part of the REF process, so it's worth thinking laterally about what your findings show and how they can be applied, perhaps outside fields of your own.
I don't know if Professor Heaven would like to add something. Do we have a comment? We have a question in the Q&A box, and perhaps I think it suits well.
Can you hear me?
Yes?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, maybe I just want to add a minor thing on this. I like the idea of thinking how we can train differently the students in universities to think how to report about negative results. At least in my experience with Devang Mehta, it was also a very interesting exercise to learn how to confront people to a new paradigm, to a new result, to learn how to, well, publishing negative results maybe requires different skills or different ways of arguing your results and also bringing new hypotheses. So I think it's something we could also probably have more integrated into our training at the universities. So I think that's something we should consider, at least for the academic people, to try to train students in releasing negative results as well.
Thank you. Please.
Hi. Hello, everyone. Thank you for the great presentation and the great discussion. Here is Tandine from Mainz, Germany. I have a real story to share, and which happened to one of my friends between 2010 and 2014. So the story begins with a knockout phenotype in mouse setting. So people observe that knockout patient, neural mutation patient, had a huge muscle mass, and then she got the PhD project about soluble myostatin blocker with the hope that it can be a potential drug. And after 3 years of mice work, it comes out a negative result. It took another long time to figure out it cannot be published. So my first question goes to two editors, what you would behave if you got those kind of submissions. And the second thing is a little comment. She managed to publish in the end in the high impact factor journal because she spent another 2 years to find a crosstalk with this signaling pathway to another signaling pathway. But I think if there are PhD candidates here, nobody would like to have a PhD thesis and then spend another 2 years to get some significant results to get published. Thank you.
So it's of course extremely difficult to comment on a specific example without knowing all the details of a study. We all know that when you come to publish a paper, the claims have to be appropriately supported in a paper, and the paper has to stand alone in its own right. And the editors of a journal will evaluate that on the basis of their own criteria, on the basis of their own editorial bar, will or will not, as the case may be, consult with the reviewers. So it is hard to make that specific comment. What I would comment on, however, is, but again, we're coming back to that kind of the desire to loosen these shackles of an impact factor. So the paper was published, and then subsequently there was additional work, which in itself discovered an interesting extension of the original finding, and that was also published. I think we should think about more in terms of publishing individual sort of stories or vignettes, if you like, findings in whatever way we choose to do that, so we can share the information with the scientific community, with the rest of the community, and then building on it, because of course that's after all how science is done. So I think, again, hard to comment on a specific case, but one way to think about it is rather than trying to build up this sort of mammoth paper that you work on repeatedly for a long time, consider what's the most useful way of disseminating that information and carrying on work, perhaps also, I don't know, in conjunction with other collaborators, taking work in another way. But each case will need to be really discussed on its own merit.
So I can actually ask a follow-up question to the supervisors in all three of you, and Hervé also, of course, can comment because he has been supervising Devang during his PhD. How difficult it is to act as a supervisor when the PhD student doesn't have results or have the results that are not expected to show up in the hypothesis. And as Devang correctly said, that a paper is not just for the leading author or the last author, it's for all the co-authors who have contributed. How difficult it has been in your experience convincing your colleagues, because no colleague are the same. You may believe in negative results, your colleagues might not believe in negative results, and facing multiple rejections because there are no takers for the manuscript that you have prepared together.
There's two separate issues for a doctoral student. One is their research training, and the other is publishing papers for their career. So as long as they've been adequately trained and they've performed the studies rigorously, then you'd hope you can convince everyone that the negative result should be published. And if they haven't performed the studies rigorously, then they probably can have difficulty passing their PhD. So it's something to disentangle the two. I think students are far too focused sometimes on just publishing, as we've all said, in high impact journals, but actually in many centres the next stage of training can be moved on to if you've just sufficiently trained and developed a technique that can be of use.
I think there are two issues there. One is on training in general on science. I think when you are a researcher, you're dealing with failure every day. And that is something that in general PhD students are not used to until they start, because they tend to be the top of their classes. They've never failed at anything. And suddenly they see that that experiment doesn't work, that this is not working as they expected. And I think that is one side of being a supervisor. And I think we do need to acknowledge that you're not your experiment. You're worth much more than that. And I think that's a conversation that I've had a few times with people I've been supervising, that the work you do is not who you are. This is just one thing. You know, I published my first paper, I think it was 3 years after I submitted my thesis, and it had nothing to do with my PhD thesis. So I didn't publish. I think from my thesis I got a review or a chapter in a book. You could have said it was a huge failure in many senses. My students now have the publication record I had many years after I had finished my PhD. But I think that also is a reflection of what we are expecting from students these days, which is not normal. I don't think we should ask them to do so much so soon, because they should be learning. That's one of the things. But again, comes back to funding and assessment. And they need all those papers if they want to get a fellowship or a job, etc. So that is not good. But I think we are also to blame, because we are, you know, we're doing these experiments, and if we see something nice, we'll publish it. We shouldn't do that. We should say, we're doing this experiment, and then we're going to tell everybody what happened. The thing is, before we probably didn't have the tools, and perhaps I shouldn't say this with two editors here, but teach the journals. I don't know, not teach the journals, but maybe there is time. It's just that if we don't all do it, we're still, I support a football club that only plays with local players. So I think it will be something similar to that. We haven't won a trophy in the last 25 years, although we still play in the first division in Spain. So it is difficult, but I think we need to change the way we think about science. And probably what we should do is to use more open repositories, bioarchive, etc. Publish it, let people know, and then give it to a journal and see if they find it interesting so they can promote it somehow, whatever. But until we are not secure in our jobs to do so, it's going to be very difficult.
Can I comment? Great challenge. Of course, I will argue that you should not ditch the journals, but I just want to, I want to pursue this idea that we have to rethink how we disseminate the fruits of what we do, what you do in the labs. I think that's absolutely key. Can I ask a question to the audience? And I know this is unfair to those who are watching us remotely. How many of you know about registered reports? There are like 3 hands up here in the room, maybe 4. I'm hoping that more of you have heard about registered reports, but just are too tired to raise your hand. So for those of you who don't know, registered reports is a format of publishing which I like to think of it as an extension of pre-registration. So what you submit to a journal is effectively a very well formulated plan of how, with a question that you're proposing to address, how you're going to address that question. That plan, before you embark on the research, is considered by the editors, is peer-reviewed, and if the peer reviewers deem that your approach to addressing the question is methodologically sound, that registered report is then accepted in principle at that journal, and assuming that you carry out the research according to plan, that paper will be published regardless of the result of the study. Nature itself does not accept registered reports yet. We're working on doing this, but a number of journals in the Nature portfolio do. Nature Communications is one of them, Nature Human Behavior, and many others. Pre-registration was mentioned. You mentioned pre-registration, I think, or possibly the previous speaker. That's one thing, and of course in clinical trials, that's exactly what happens in the case of clinical trials, but pre-registration has become more common in other types of research. I am actually very enthusiastic about registered reports because it placed the emphasis on how science is done, how it's done, not necessarily its outcome. And it changes that dichotomous perspective, which we keep repeating here in the conversation, between positive results and negative results. I would like to put it to you that part of the problem lies in our nomenclature. We call it negative results, even though actually under the umbrella there are a number of different types of results. There are null results and some negative results that go against previous dogma are actually really exciting and really impactful, and we had some examples of that before. So maybe we should overcome the nomenclature, not think about it as negative results, because nobody likes anything negative. That's actually not the point.
Unless it's a COVID test.
Unless it's a COVID test, fair point. But of course, this is valuable output. So let's focus on how it's done, on that integrity, that honesty. And then once we focus on that, I think it'll be easier to deal with the problem that we're discussing here.
I think that we can move them to the audience. We have more, it seems, 2 more questions, please.
Well, hello. First of all, a very quick observation and then a question, if that's okay. I think there's an element of anthropology underlying this issue with the bias towards positive results, in the sense that I think humans have evolved to tell stories, and usually there's a sort of ending, which is, and you find a supply of berries over that hill over there. And so I think I think in trying to restore the balance between positive and negative results, I think we're kicking against deep human instincts. However, the question is, do you think the linear model of authorship on papers is contributing to the problem? There's so much weight given to first and last authorships in terms of assessing publication outputs. A PhD student might contribute to several papers during their PhD, but only their one first authorship paper will be the one which contributes most towards their career prospects. If we moved away from a linear model of authorship, and surely that must be possible in an era when we're moving away from paper and ink reports, would we be able to credit that PhD student for their for the contribution to all 7 papers that they contributed during their PhD lifespan?
Andy, I agree with you, but also for clinical papers, we have to have someone at the end of the list taking responsibility for things if they're not quite true or something goes wrong. So you're right, authorship needs to be revisited, but I like to keep things simple as an editor, keep things linear, think of impact factors, who's responsible, who's done what. There must be smarter people than me who can think of a way around it, but I suspect, like with your anthropology story, things have evolved in a certain way, having a consultant, having a house officer, having a PhD student, so that we can see who's responsible for what and how to keep things as safe as we can. But there must be a better way.
Can I suggest that the 2 points are not incompatible? So you can still have a senior author who's responsible in some way, and of course, in terms of publishing, we have senior authors who take responsibility for a number of duties associated with publishing. But there are ways to acknowledge the contribution of a great variety of authors, and we know in the human genetics field there are papers with authorship running into hundreds. So in the Nature portfolio journals, we've had for at least a decade very granular author contribution statement, which says exactly what each author has contributed to the paper, whether it's bioinformatic analysis in the context of a much larger study, in which case that author is going to be somewhere in the middle, but clearly absolutely crucial contribution, whether it's data curation or collection or whatever it is. I think that granular contribution, recognition of that contribution is absolutely crucial. We don't pay enough attention to it. There is another a sort of concerted effort to address exactly that issue, and that's credit taxonomy. So it exists out there. It's trying to solve exactly that problem. It considers what type of contributions to a paper warrant authorship and how they should be acknowledged in a paper. So credit taxonomy is independent of a journal or a publisher, but it tries to address the problem that we've addressed with author contribution statement, which is mandatory on every paper, and every paper carries it. We still, of course, list the authors in a linear way.
And often the papers get referred to by their first author. That becomes the name of, Smith et al. Becomes the name of the paper. I'm mindful in physics they have an alphabetized, authors are just alphabetized, but in biology we tend to still go by.
That's right.
And I think what you mentioned about the storytelling idea is quite true. We all like to be the heroes of our own stories, and actually we don't like it when we find something that, we didn't cure this disease, this didn't quite work. But I think we should probably focus more also while we are talking with our researchers about the journey and not the final chapter. And I think this is the main point probably of any research, that you need to do it right during the journey. And then you may get one or another outcome, and that doesn't matter. But I think we need a kind of a change of way of thinking about research.
Which is why I think your maze analogy works really well. Because if you go down at a dead end and you leave some torches there, there's a story there, a story you can tell.
Hi, so I wanted to put up for discussion something. It's often very hard to refute a previously published positive result, right? Because it's like really difficult to make sure that that is not true. It's much harder to prove that something is not true than to prove that something is true, because if something is true, you can just get a statistical significant p-value. But then if you don't get a statistical significant p-value, you might be like, oh, well, you need a bigger sample size to see that difference. Or just in general, like, an antibody doesn't work. You have to test more conditions or things like that. And what do you think about that? Like, as a PhD student, it's so much harder to make sure that something doesn't work than just move on to the next thing and try something else.
In my simple understanding, we were too broad in defining a positive result. So a p-value less than a nominal significance does not necessarily mean the finding's true or clinically important. That, in my simple way of thinking, that's part of the problem. We're defining a positive result just on statistical significance, or we saw some antibody staining, and perhaps we need to be more rigorous somewhat in our positive results definition. And yes, you're right, in many clinical studies we need much larger sample sizes to conclusively conclude there's no effect, but that's good science, and it should be applied in both negative and positive findings.
Yeah, but most papers are published based on statistical p-values. Like
yeah, but lots of people don't like them.
Yeah, but
most people prefer effect sizes, and I'm trying to broaden the argument and say there's a problem with defining a positive finding sometimes.
Maybe I could add on this. Can you hear me well?
Sure, please.
Yes, so indeed, I tend to agree with the comment that was just made on for us publishing those negative results. The editor was much more demanding in providing evidence that we were contradicting previous reports. We also faced the issue that we had seen several flaws in the papers that were publishing positive, so-called positive results. And for us, then it was very difficult to convince the editor who was actually monitoring the publishing of those positive results to see the limitation or maybe the mistake that might have been done during the reviewing process. So I think if we want to address the issue that we are talking about today, it's not only about what I said before. I think in our community, we need to change a bit the culture of looking at results and see what is the added value of those results. But probably also the change needs also to come probably from the journals, if they can, if there are things they can do, also to look more critical at the reviewing process. And I think there are several initiatives now that are helping this. To see maybe that there were some points that were omitted in the analysis, in the critical analysis of the positive results, and not to be afraid to go back actually to say, yeah, indeed we missed this and this point, and this new study now is providing evidence that this was not correct. Another suggestion I would also make, which I think could help the readers and the community of scientific papers, is to maybe further link, I mean, those big impact journals and those big impact articles that are published there, to not to hesitate to link two contradictory stories and studies directly on the page of those articles. I think it would also help the community to sense whether we are really dealing with something really positive, or with the optimism that has been there at the beginning, or if there is over time several papers showing that this is actually contradicting. I think it would help the community to see that, because eventually, I will finish with that. I think that it was addressed in the previous talk. I think it is also a matter of publishing to a high impact journal. I mean, if you have a positive result published in a very high impact journal, it was at least the case for us. We could have published our story or a study in a low impact journal. It would have been not a problem, I think. But we know that in the community, people always also value the importance of a result according to the impact factor. So for us, the challenge has also been to make sure that because the positive results were published in a very high impact, we had to bring our study also in a relatively high impact journal for the credibility of the study we presented.
Thank you, Professor van der Schoren. I think we only have time for one quick question. So please go ahead.
Thank you. My name's Tara Clancy. I'm from Manchester in the UK. I was wondering, this is, I think, about null as well as negative results, and perhaps particularly in the context of clinical trials, the extent to which non-disclosure agreements might impact on those, which is a slightly different issue than we've talked about so far.
I've never heard of a non-disclosure agreement in a clinical trial of an investigative medicinal product. I'm not primarily a drug trialist, but as I've been involved in, nowadays you almost always have to pre-register your study, certainly in the UK.
I think that there are non-disclosure agreements. Maybe it depends on which phase a clinical trial is happening at.
Don't sign them. Don't sign them. Don't get involved with that sort of thing. Is my personal view. I wouldn't want to publish a paper where there's a history of NDAs in the background. They've been used to silence all sorts of people over, as you know, over all sorts of allegations.
So as we begin to close this session, I have one last question to the editors. Prestige publishing. We all have been there. We have all dreamed of it, partly because this is how we are nurtured, as we have seen in our scientific careers. But how do you think, Dr. Magdalena, how do you think nature can lead the way in fixing the problem of publishing negative results? Perhaps a special edition, or finally introducing some much needed changes in the peer review process? And same question, LSTR as well.
Since you called my name first, I will respond first. So first of all, I don't think we need a special edition, because of course if we're going to change the status quo, it needs to be part of everyday working practice. I think the task of changing the status quo is shared by all of us. I use this term research ecosystem. I really believe that we're different stakeholders that are part of the same system, together with funders, together with heads of your universities, institutions, wherever it is you work, and of course together with the private sector, because an awful lot of research happens in the private sector as well. The system has been changing and evolving, not fast enough in my view, and certainly in our pages at Nature, we have changed quite a lot of aspects of how we work and what we consider. In the context of acknowledging contribution of authors, I already mentioned author contribution statement, which has been around for at least a decade on the journal. We increasingly support our authors in actually equitably and inclusively acknowledging the authors. And just the other day, we published an editorial on a framework that we've introduced to guard against helicopter research and ethics dumping. That's another example along these lines. In terms of opening up science, and this goes to what you said about sharing different types of scientific output, for a very long time, especially for research from this community, we have either mandated or strongly encouraged data sharing, and we have supported, of course, we allow citations, DOI citations to data and so on. We have supported the data deposition, and where appropriate, we do the same for code. And in fact, facilitate peer review of code and then sharing of code where appropriate in papers. In terms of peer review, we increasingly champion transparent peer review. So we publish referee reports together with author rebuttals, so that whole process is transparent. And we actually encourage our reviewers to be named on papers. So there is transparency of who reviewed the paper. So the whole process, different aspects of that are transparent. And of course, last and not least, and perhaps I should have started with it, is while Nature, being a multidisciplinary journal, has seen preprints as completely compatible with its existence as a journal, because clearly preprints were born out of the physical sciences community, and we publish in that space as well. At the end of 2019, actually before the pandemic, we came out as saying that we will actually strongly encourage, not just support preprint deposition, but we will encourage our authors to deposit preprints. And during the pandemic, all of the papers, COVID-related papers that were submitted to us, had to be deposited as preprints. So that was a mandate for that particular field. So these are just a few examples of how we have changed and revised our practices. And I mentioned, for example, registered reports. We have some proportion of our papers which are pre-registered, not enough, and I would encourage you as the community to pre-register more of your papers. The last thing I would say is I really welcome suggestions from the community how we can continue to work with you to continue to revise our practice.
Some quick comments, Alistair?
I think until impact factor goes away from being the main route to career progression, prestige publishing will be here to stay. So the funders and universities will have to drive change, not just.
So this was a wonderful session, and we would like to thank both our speakers, Dr. Devang Mehta and Professor Virginia Arcaleva Gomeza, and our panelists, Professor Hervé van der Schuren, Dr. Magdalena Schieper, Dr. Alistair McNeill. Some assurances from the leading journal that it is possible to publish.
And we like to take this opportunity to thank the ECHE and in particular Professor Alexandre Raymond for his patience and amazing level of support for us to organize this session. We wish to announce the election results for the ECGY committee 2022-2024. If possible, could you please put the slides for us? We received 9 applications, and the CG trainees participate in online voting system to choose 4 candidates. Just a moment. No? Okay. Just a moment, I will check that.
So I think because of this technical issue, maybe we can announce the result on social media. This is not the end of our ESHGY interaction during the ESHG 2022 conference. We would like to invite all of you here to attend our Meeting Up event tomorrow at 12:15 at the ESHGY lounge. And we have like what I said, it's an amazing lounge that you can visit and interact with us in Hall X4. Additionally, we have a hybrid poster in Poster Hall X3 describing all the activities we have been doing in the last years.
No. Thank you. Please check the elections results in our social media. We are also presenting in the lounge. Okay, thank you.